My name is Hans Alhoff. I'm the chair of Altadena Heritage. We are together again. Thank you all for being here. We have one guest of honor I want to acknowledge at the outset. I want to thank her for her amazing service to Altadena during this time. Victoria Knapp, where are you? To introduce her, to introduce our speaker. So Veronica Jones, please come on up.
Good evening.
Good evening.
And welcome. I am pleased to introduce Tim Gregory, a distinguished member of the Altadena Historical Society's board. I have known Tim over the last 5 years, so I can vouch for Tim's deep knowledge and understanding of Altadena. His insights are shared with a quiet yet captivating passion that leaves a lasting impression. As we gather to celebrate Tim's work, let's remember the wise words of writer and historian William Faulkner, who said, "The past is not dead, it's not even past." Tim's commitment to historical preservation reflects this idea of making sure our history stays alive and current in the present and the future. Tim's education and experience is outstanding. He has master's degrees in library science, public history, historical preservation. Tim has significantly impacted his field. His founding of the Building Biographer in 1992, with over 3,000 property histories completed throughout Los Angeles County, demonstrates Tim's commitment to preserving history. Please join me in welcoming Tim Gregory.
Well, thank you for that nice introduction. I hope you can all hear me. One thing about getting older, my voice is getting a lot softer, so I have to be sure to speak into the microphone. There was a time when I could address a group without a microphone, but those times are past. Well, thank you for that nice introduction. Halfway through, I thought, who in the world is she talking about? But you have to realize that the longer you live, the more stuff you have done, and sometimes you don't remember all that stuff. Tonight's turnout is very gratifying to me. The presentation on architecture always seems to spark an interest, probably because, aside from flora and fauna, buildings are such a tangible element of our surroundings until they are gone. How many of us, and I hope I'm not the only one that thought this, how many of us have driven home from work with something big in our minds and landed at home without much memory of how we got there? We subconsciously use the landmarks along the way to find the route. So when our landmarks disappear, we become disoriented. At least once a week, I drive to the intersection of Altadena Drive and Santa Rosa and don't know where I am until I look at the street sign. All of the familiar landmarks on all four corners have disappeared. I had contemplated naming my presentation a legacy and a eulogy, but that just sounded too final and too macabre. After all, Altadena is still a living entity, even if so much of it is hurting right now. Goethe is said to have defined architecture as frozen music. And indeed, Altadena's current and past architectural resources continue to sing to us in nostalgic elegy, albeit in a much more subdued tones right now. The first part of my presentation will include how Altadena Heritage embarked on an historic resources survey in the late 1980s, and how it morphed into AHAD, or the Altadena Heritage Architectural Database. Then I'll share with you a once-over lightly review of individual examples of local architectural types. It all started when I paid Caltech $1 for this house and moved it from my childhood neighborhood on South Catalina Avenue in Pasadena to the north side of Altadena Drive between Marengo and Fair Oaks in 1983. The adventure of moving 40 tons of house, divided into 3 parts, through town in the wee hours of the morning is worth a program in itself. I'll digress with one short anecdote. My sister and I were standing at the corner of Mariposa and Fair Oaks at 3 a.m. when it was still a dangerous intersection. A sheriff stopped by in his car and asked what the hell we were doing standing there. I replied, I'm waiting for my house to come by. Well, thank goodness he had seen it coming up the street and didn't haul us off to the drunk tank. Be careful, is all he said as he sped off. Although I sold the house some years ago, it still pains me when I drive by the site today and see that the house disappeared last January, as well as all of its neighbors. As I was putting the finishing touches on the restoration of my house, I got to thinking how little the Altadena public, including myself, seemed to know about its historic and architectural resources. I felt that Altadena needed some sort of historic resources survey, much like the city of Pasadena was doing. After all, the architects that worked in Pasadena also designed buildings in Altadena, and some of them even lived here. I wrote a letter to the town council asking if they would support such a project. As luck would have it, they had just formed an historic preservation committee and asked if I'd like to chair it. Although this was way beyond what I initially had in mind, I accepted, thinking this would probably be the only way to get a survey done. So I created a committee of 20 or so members, which met monthly at each other's houses. There were some members who thought we should start lying in front of the bulldozers right away, prevent demolitions. But I cautioned them that we really needed to know what historic resources we had in town before we could convince anyone they needed preserving. It's important to note that Altadena had never had all of its historic resources formally identified before. Although we received moral support from the town council, the LA County Landmarks Commission, and the State Office of Historic Preservation, no funds were available from them. So we decided to fundraise to get the job done ourselves. As far as I know, we were the only non-governmental community group in the state to do just this. Just another example of Altadenans deciding to independently get the job done. Since it was customary in those days not to include properties that were 50 years old or less, we decided to limit the survey to those structures built before World War II. Later on, we added to the list a number of more contemporary properties recommended by preservation-minded realtors and architectural historians. In order to solicit funds, Altadena Heritage Incorporated is a 501c3 organization independent of the town council in 1988. We organized home tours, solicited donations, and hosted a garden party every June. The first party in 1987 was a huge success. Here's an image of me at that first party. For some reason, I decided that having suspenders holding up my britches was just the right thing to wear. I looked impossibly young. It was heartwarming to see so many Altadenans gathering together with an obvious love for their community and its history. So many people stopped me to tell me stories of their houses that I grabbed napkins to furiously write down what they said. When I got home, my pockets were stuffed with wadded up napkins, most of which I couldn't read. Naturally, there are a few cynics in the crowd who claim that we were in the pockets of realtors. Naturally, there were we did have several realtors in our group, but who knew better where otherwise hidden resources were located? Some people said that we had too many upscale members who also belonged to the Altadena Guild of the Huntington Hospital. But all I can say is those ladies sure knew how to throw a party and supplied our garden parties with incredible homemade refreshments. Over a couple of years, we raised $20,000, back when $20,000 was really $20,000, and hired professional consultants to tackle the preliminary survey, which was called a windshield survey. That literally is what it was, as the consultants drove up and down every street in Altadena and unincorporated northern Pasadena, listing the addresses of all the historical resources, mostly residential, from their car, with a brief note as to their architectural styles and numbers of stories. Here is a sample page of their results. To make the results and our budget more manageable, we divided the community into 4 quadrants, centered on the intersection of Lake and Altadena Drive, and held a meeting in each quadrant of residents to explain what we were doing. We prepared meeting invitations to every household, placing labels on the envelopes during several mailing parties. In order to keep everybody happy, I plied them with wine, It's probably not a good idea, since I had to proof all the envelopes after the parties to be sure the labels hadn't been applied upside down and the envelopes weren't made soggy by over-enthusiastic sealing. Our professional consultants were Johnson Human Associates before Christy Johnson McAvoy founded the Historic Resources Group, and Judy Train of the San Juan and Buenaventura Research Associates. They met several times with us to go over the results and make recommendations as to how we should proceed. The results of the survey were rather staggering, even for those of us who knew Altadena was historically rich. The consultants listed 3,228 properties that could be considered historical resources. 91 that with deeper research might qualify for listing on the National Register of Historic Places, and 39 potential historic districts. All this in a community of only 43,000 residents. Complicating our research was the fact that the county didn't issue building permits until late 1927, and most of the permits issued between 1927 and World War II had disappeared, meaning that the construction history of all of our craftsmen and period revival treasures was undocumented by government agencies, which included their architects and first owners. We also learned that Altadena addresses were renumbered by the post office in 1928 and 1941. Many streets had also changed their names over time. Some old houses in Altadena have had as many as 4 different addresses during their lifetimes. This is a sample page of street name changes tracked by one of our research teams, which they found by comparing maps. The list goes on for 2.5 pages, so you can see well, the streets in Altadena, especially in West Altadena, really changed a lot. One of the many maps they consulted was this one, which you have seen in several past presentations. One thing that dawned on me as I looked at the map, which many of you have probably known for years, is that most of the major east-west streets south of Altadena Drive, then known as Piedmont, were named after California counties. Hence, we have Ventura, Sacramento, Alameda, Sonoma, Calaveras, Mendocino, and Mariposa. This scheme was supposed to extend north of Piedmont, with such street names as Tulare, Tuolumne, Fresno, Humboldt, Palusa, and Shasta. But it never happened, probably because northwest Altadena developed more slowly, and the naming scheme had long since been abandoned. Similarly, north-south streets were to be named after Spanish female saints, but Santa Rosa and Santa Anita are all that remain. El Molino was long known as Santa Clara until it was lined up with the El Molino coming up from Pasadena. Such other names as Santa Maria and Santa Teresa never came to pass. The main takeaway from this map is that Altadena was meant right from the beginning to be residential, with few commercial areas indicated. Another map was consulted was this one of the Altadena Country Club Park. We realized that the streets that ran through the tract were named for well-known golf courses of the time: Midlothian, Braemar, Glenview, Meadowbrook, and Midwick. This Midwick was an upscale golf course and polo club near Alhambra, which didn't survive the Depression. The only street name that puzzled us was Minoru. It was only lately that I discovered that Minoru was the name of a British Columbia company that had invested heavily in the Altadena Country Club Park development. It owned a racetrack in Canada that was named Minoru after a champion Japanese racehorse. While the results of the windshield survey were coming in, we had volunteers and paid researchers combing through newspapers and architectural periodicals looking for articles on the construction and sale of Altadena buildings. We discovered that although the actual building permits were missing, they had been summarized in weekly issues of the Builder and Contractor Journal. After perusing all this microfilm, capturing information about the permits, as well as such items as notices of completion and lists of contracts recorded, I went directly from wearing no glasses to wearing bifocals. I'm glad to say that Hathi Trust has now digitized the Builder and Contractor up to 1929, which makes research 100 times easier than when I was doing it. This is a sample page from our instructions to researchers. Another team took photographs of most of the historic resources following written directions we gave them to guarantee conformity, a page of which is shown here. These photos have since proven invaluable, as we now have images of almost all the resources as they looked around 1990. For many of those that would disappear in the fire, it's sometimes the only visual record we have of them. I would like to give a shout out to Camille Dudley, who's in the audience now, and also she gave you the names of the other 3 photographers, whose names I'd forgotten actually, Lynn McDaniel, Mary Baum, and John Balian. For many of those who disappeared in the fire, sometimes the only visual record we have was of properties. The team thanks to their work, we have an unprecedented opportunity to know what Altadena's historic and architectural resources looked like before the fire. I benefited personally from all this because during the survey, I quit my public library management job, earned a second master's degree in historic preservation and community history, and set up my building biographer business. I was able to use the report of the survey as my master's degree project. The report contains a 52-page context statement, which is essentially a history of the community and the types of buildings that were produced in each historical era. I included an extensive bibliography, one of whose pages is shown here. Our project could be described as an enhanced historic resources survey, where resources were listed and much preliminary research was done. It fell short of a full historic resources inventory, since we did not complete inventory forms for each of the resources, which would have taken much more volunteer effort and fundraising, and frankly, at that point, after over 3 years, we were pooped. You have to remember that other than the computerized list of resources from the consultants, the results of the survey and the research were mostly all analog hard copy form. It's only at the end of the survey that we had a volunteer who spent months entering the windshield lists and all the research then on index cards into a database. Unfortunately, the database software she used is no longer viable. I'm glad to say the migration of this data has been successful, and the Altadena Heritage Architectural Database, or AHAD, is again up and running. However, it still needs work. Obtaining an architectural, historical, and photographic information on each resource is more cumbersome than it used to be. And the idea we once had of being able to retrieve resources by architect's name or by style never came to pass. However, the data is still useful. Altadena had changed very little since the early 1990s. In fact, in the Guide to Historic Places that Altadena Heritage published around 1993, only one of the 40 locations listed had disappeared 35 years later. The county recently funded a detailed historic resources survey of the African American community in West Altadena, which was badly needed. The historic resources surveys of the late 80s and early 90s, and ours is no exception, were more concerned with architectural significance than with the importance of perhaps more modest buildings that were significant in minority and ethnic history. The historians who conducted the West Altadena survey also produced inventory forms for each historic resource, making it a true inventory and not just a survey. The Getty Foundation, via the Los Angeles Conservancy, is going to donate over $400,000 to fund a new historic resources survey of Altadena. Frankly, I think this is an example of closing the barn door after the cow or whatever mentioned has escaped, seeing as how it comes after we have just lost over 50% of our historic resources and almost half of our National Register properties. It would have been much more useful if it had happened a few years ago when Altadena was still intact. However, it will be a chance to make a deep dive into what is left, hopefully producing inventory forms for each surviving resource. But the survey Altadena Heritage produced over 35 years ago is still valid and can be used as a basis for research. I would hate to see the Getty money being used to reinvent the wheel. A new context statement can be at least partly based on the one I wrote back in 1991, on Michelle Zach's excellent history of Altadena, and on the community history included in the recent West Altadena study. This is probably a good time to make a big plug for Michelle's book, which the Historical Society will be reprinting before the end of this year. It will be especially valuable to those whose original copies were lost in the fire. There may, of course, be a need for another windshield survey to document what is lost, and if it's done soon, it can be accomplished rather quickly by reading the addresses on signs posted on each cleared lot by the Army Corps of Engineers. It will be very interesting, if a tad depressing, to compare the current list of resources with that of the 1990s to document how much is lost. The Getty Foundation project promises to include input from as many local community groups as possible and will include technological features such as computerized mapping of cultural resources, embedded interviews with Altadenans as to how they view their community, and a summary of where we are today. This is really a cultural resources survey rather than purely an historic resources survey, which I think is more descriptive of what the end result is supposed to be. But it will be hampered by the disappearance of so many of our resources and the dispersal of so many of our former residents, especially from the west side. Altadenans throughout history have been rather skeptical of large programs imposed on us by outside organizations as we firstly guard our independence. So we'll have to just wait and see how this all develops and how much we are all going to be involved. The main point I want to make is that we shouldn't reinvent the wheel, and so much in the way of preliminary listings and research has already been done. In preparing tonight's slides, I was at first overwhelmed with the amount of material. Then as I read my survey report again, I recalled that under each style and property type in the context statement, I had listed a number of addresses I thought were good examples. This is what I used as a basis of my selection. So you will forgive me if any of your favorite buildings have been omitted. But if I'd included all 3,000 plus historic properties, you would all be running through the doors after the first hour is up. In order to differentiate the properties that remain from those that have been lost, you will note that the destroyed properties are shown in black and white, and the surviving properties in color. I also erred on the side of including properties where the architect has been identified. Looking over the photos, I see that still standing buildings outnumber those that have been lost. Or perhaps it's just a defensive move on my part to ward off mourning all the ghosts. As Altadena rebuilds, I hope that the variety of architectural styles we inherited is appreciated and honored. We don't want to take a cookie-cutter approach to quickly fill the empty lots with look-alike boxes or prefabs. The Historic Resources Survey that Altadena Heritage undertook years ago documents in research and photographs the variety of architecture we once had, and that can hopefully inspire the designers and developers of today. Since the bulk of Altadena's pre-fire architecture was residential, I'm including just a few examples of the more notable commercial and institutional buildings, mostly along 8 Lake Avenue. The Cobb Garage, designed by Wallace Neff, was designed for cars from Mr. Cobb's estate at the top of Lake Avenue. And why his garage is so far down on Lake, I don't know. Later, it was the home of the Theosophical Society. And I think the loss of their collections is even more tragic than the loss of the building itself. There's the St. Elizabeth's Church, another Wallace Neff edifice that did survive the fire. It's the only church that Neff ever designed, which makes it very important. This is a former bank building. It has been altered. It used to have a flat roof, and now it's got a mansard roof. And the mezzanine over at the front entrance was not quite so visible at one point. It does show you how Altadena seemed to have enough money to afford a really decent bank. This is in the 1920s. I couldn't resist putting a picture here of Elliott, which I think is one of the finest design schools in all of California. I had to kind of think about how I wanted to make it half black and white and half color. But I know they've torn down the auditorium and the back part of the campus was gutted. But I'm hoping that the tower and whatever faces Lake Avenue can be restored. The school district has no money, but I'm hoping the insurance will help pay for some of it.
Tim, it's Victoria. I just want you to know that the Army Corps has completed its debris removal at Elliott, and we will be wrapping up their mission there on Monday morning at 10 a.m.
Good to hear. This is our Davies building, which was built as a WPA project and was the first Altadena community center. During the Depression, the community kind of lost control of it and the county took over. But if it hadn't been for the Depression, this may have been our town hall. All that's left of the chimneys. The loss in town of 3 traditional auditoriums and stages will certainly be felt. They include the Davies Building, the Elliott Middle School, and the Altadena Community Church's Hiker Hall, where those all had established stages. This is the old Altadena Library on Lake Avenue, which later became the photography studio for a Playboy photographer. We sometimes wonder why all these courageous ladies are lined up outside. That was why. It later became a private residence. This shows that even retained commercial buildings can have a certain amount of style. And our beloved But Altadena Community Church, which burned down, is now just, in fact, I think it was just last week that the Army Corps finally cleared the lot. Not to leave out the west side, but the Benjamin Franklin School from 1955 was a complete loss. And the architect, Culver Eaton, was known for his church architecture. That's the first time I've seen him, something that he designed from an educational point. The rest of the slides will be on residential styles. Styles are sometimes really difficult to differentiate. Many architects came to Southern California to leave behind the traditional styles of the East Coast and experiment with a combination of styles. Some, like Wallace Neff and Roland Coate, were actually looking to create a unique California style. So it's sometimes difficult to settle on a single design style when describing any of these. The time frames for the various styles shown are not always the same as those assigned by architectural historians, but reflect the eras when various styles predominated in Altadena. This catch-all style designation includes structures generally built before 1900. Styles range from exuberant wood detailing associated with the Queen Anne substyle to the more restrained subtlety of the Eastlake substyle. Victorians are most often perpendicular with wood clapboard or shingle siding, steep gabled roofs, double-hung sash windows, and asymmetrical placement of openings. Only a few Victorians were built in Altadena, mostly of the undecorated variety, which refit a largely agricultural non-urban community. This is the Fair Oaks Ranch House, which dates all the way back to 1865. It was moved at some point from the Eaton Ranch. It's considered to be the oldest frame residence in the San Gabriel Valley. It may be like a docent who was explaining George Washington's axe to a crowd of tourists. So this is originally George Washington's axe. Of course, the handle and axe head had been changed a few times. So we know that the Fair Oaks Ranch House is in there somewhere that might have been changed over the years. This is, of course, the famous Woodbury House. On the left is how it looked in 1887. On the right-hand side is how it looks now, where it's been hemmed in by a lot of 1950s houses. And there was a music room was added by design by Brewery. This is the Crank House on the east side of Altadena. Actually, it's in the 91104 part of Pasadena, but we claim that as Altadena. And it was featured a lot in the series of Murder, She Wrote. It looks so much like New England. And I was disappointed by it. My family, some crucial part of the mystery, I'd shout out, "Well, that's the Crank House," trying to spoil their illusion. And of course, the beloved McNally House. The front facade of many of these early houses face south for the views and have access to their nearby private railroad sidings. I prepared the successful National Register application for this house. It was wonderful. We went there for a Christmas party once, and they still had the gas lighting. So they turned off the electricity and just had the gas going, and it was so atmospheric. Of course, he probably would have gotten in trouble with the county for having the gas still operating, but we enjoyed it. And the Schumann House, which has been used a lot in commercials like this. So later on Woodbury. And this is just over the fence here in the parking lot. There's what's left of the Green Mansion, which used to occupy the site where the library is. It gives you an idea of what the greenhouse looked like. I don't know where the idea for the castle-like tower came from, because that was a part of the greenhouse. And this is what we used to call the Gillette Hunting Lodge, and it's where we had our first garden party. Unfortunately, it just burned down. But when we did further research, we found it actually was probably the first ranch house of the Porter family, who named Porter Avenue, and also was the first subdivision in East Altadena was the Porter Ranch. But the gates to the ranch still stand, and some people have given Green and Green the credit for this because it looks so much like the entrance to Oak Lawn in South Pasadena. But we don't really know for sure. This is is another house in 91104 Pasadena. I remember this house as having the most exquisite parquet floors. It's kind of plain from the outside, and I think it's been painted red since this picture was taken. I remember the floors are really standout. And this is one of the last remaining house by the Allen family on Pepper Drive. Built around 1900. First time I saw it, it didn't have all that walls and the shrubbery in front of it, so it's not, you can't really see it too well. But it has been well maintained. And it is probably the oldest house in East Pasadena, besides the Fair Oaks Ranch House. And this is known as Idle Hour in the West Altadena. In early panoramas of West Altadena, you can see it all by itself, surrounded by fields and orchards. It has some pre-known features, such as the corner tower with a conical roof, sometimes referred to as a witch's hat. That's all gone. Transitional style bridged the gap between the Victorian and Craftsman eras and lasted just a few years. It retained the large bulk and massing typical of Victorians, but had minimum decoration and more attention to individual craftsmanship, like the Craftsman houses. Some echoed early California influences. A sub-style known as Mission Revival had plaster walls, arches, and tile roofs reminiscent of the missions. As with the Victorians, not too many of these transitional types were built before the era of great population growth. This is the Benziger house in Mariposa. It served as an orphanage during World War II and later became an art commune. Scripps Hall, which was the home of William Scripps, the publisher, what later became the famed campus of Waldorf School. And this house was moved twice. Once from wherever it started in Los Angeles to University Park in LA, and from University Park in 1981 it was moved to Altadena. That was the fatal move because it didn't survive the fire. But it certainly is more of a Queen Anne's style because of all the decoration. And the owner said he was sure it was haunted because he looked up one day from where he was sitting and he saw somebody coming down the stairs and he knew there was nobody else in the house but him. And this guy had very old-fashioned clothes. He said he didn't think he was dreaming. I think this really was. It's a wonder the fellow wasn't bounced out of the house by all the moving it had. And of course the famous Zane Grey house and their great loss. It was built to withstand fire, but domestic type fire, not wildfires. So I believe most of the concrete walls have survived the fire, but the inner wood partitions and so on are all burned up. And this was a good example of Mission Revival with the arched openings, the tile roof, and all the tree kind of, for instance, seeing it, but there was a main entry which looked like something out of the Missions. The Craftsman houses utilized low-pitched gabled roofs with pronounced wood detailing, wood lap or shingle siding, a row of stone and clinker bricks, bands of windows and porches to minimize the break between nature and the interior of the house. Unlike earlier styles, the structural elements of Craftsman design, like beams and brackets, were exposed and became part of the decoration of the house. Although most of us think of Craftsman houses as being single-story or rectangular, a number of them echo two-story Swiss chalets, and some were inspired by Asian precedents. This is one of the few styles that had a definite end. GIs returning from the trenches of World War I were disillusioned with the Craftsman philosophy of the perfectibility of man and yearned for other styles. As Mercy Ovnick observed in Los Angeles, The End of the Rainbow, the movies were a big influence as people began to appreciate more exotic period revival locales. Some Craftsman houses were built after 1918, but they are more accurately called California bungalows, being much plainer and more standardized than earlier Craftsman houses. This is a good example of a pitched roof Craftsman with a shingle siding and an open porch. And this is a few houses we had in Altadena designed by the Green Brothers. It's a very modest cottage, but it was one of their early, Severia cottage, one of their early works. This is a good example of how Craftsman houses were meant to blend into their environment. And most Craftsman houses originally were, brown or natural colors. But these people have decided that they want to spruce up a little bit, which is fine. Paint can be removed. This is a wonderful house by the Heinrich brothers that was originally across the street from where I'm living now, replaced by an ugly condominium building. It was moved in 1981 to the corner of Porter and Altadena Drive. And it actually survived the fire. And I think it's rustic. The environment is much more fitting than it was out in the busy streets of Pasadena. This is a chalet like Craftsman with the well-known venting in the gable, the top of the gable, and the exposed knee brace brackets. And the bands of windows. Windows were usually set in bands rather than just a single window. And you can already see the house and all the shrubbery. This is another great example of nature and how the house is designed to fit into nature. Well, look at the length of that gable end on the right side. It was all the way down almost to the ground. Henry Cook, the architect, was an Englishman, so maybe he thought he could break California's rules of style with impunity. This was architect George Webster's own home. Webster is a bit of a mystery. Born in Uruguay, probably of missionary parents, he was a prolific designer of craftsman homes, particularly in Altadena, but then suddenly stopped designing and more or less disappeared until he popped up again many years later in San Clemente, where he died. Another example of a craftsman bungalow blending in with a drought-tolerant garden. There's a slightly Asian look to the gable where it comes to a point at the top. And look at those arroyo stone walls. Arroyo stone is a cheap building material since it could be collected for free in the nearby Arroyo Seco. This is a house known as Rose Wall, again by George Webster. It got its name from a huge climbing rose that ran along its westerly fence. The flowers were used to decorate floats in the early rose parade. The remarkable mix of arroyo stone and clinker brick in the property-line walls were actually of recent origin. When I first saw the house, those walls weren't there. Do you know what clinker brick is? Those of you on tours, I'm sure know. It was brick that was left in the ovens too long and turned purple and kind of misshapen. And they were called clinkers because they were mistakes and they were thrown out until architects began to think these are wonderful little details we can put in our houses. So then the factory started making clinker bricks on purpose. We think George Webster studied under the Green brothers because his house has a definitely green look to it. And a nice sturdy craftsman that didn't survive the fire. And this is the Walter Valentine house that was mentioned in Hans' presentation. It was very oriental in its inspiration, but it made room for garage inserted at its bottom level. An illustration of the house was used as Altadena's Heritage first logo. John Vesmajian, who was the owner of the house at the time, had just had an artist create a letterhead for him, and he kindly let us use that image as our first logo. Because we thought it blended the idea of a rustic house with a tree. That was how we thought about it at the time. And this comes from a hand-colored postcard. You can note the rear end of a Model T in the driveway. This house is a good example of intricate carpentry seen on upscale craftsman residences. You can see the double roof line and the intricate carpentry holding up the roof, the porch roof. Colonial Revival style includes all variety of neoclassical and classical modes, from the simple bungalow to elaborate antebellum mansions. But most include classical detailing, symmetrical facades, multi-pane sash windows with lap siding and columns. This is a difficult style to generalize about, as it has been recurring waves of popularity from before the turn of the 20th century through to the current period. This is a real southern plantation type house. It was designed by an Altadena architect, actually. This is my favorite Colonial Revival. I call it Colonial Revival on steroids. It was one of my favorite houses and used a lot in music locations. In fact, they used to truck in snow to make it look like a new house. Unfortunately, it didn't survive. But later, not too much later, house in the Country Club Park. And this is by Wallace Neff. I never thought of Wallace Neff designing colonial revival houses in this case. And here's a later example of colonial revival showing how the style has endured over the years. This is from 1939. Prairie style is a very rare style in Altadena, well, anywhere in the country really, or in the West Coast, since it is usually found in more urban communities. Prairie houses have flat roofs, symmetrical elevations, a plaster or wood band between the first and second floors, deep-set front porches, and bands of windows. This style is typically associated with Frank Lloyd Wright and is found most frequently in prairie states like Illinois, hence the name. This one was really more Italian in influence but had some prairie features. It was once a private residence and became the home of the Altadena Senior Center right next door to the library. This was the best example of the prairie style I have seen anywhere. For green and green aficionados, Kate Duncan was the first owner of their Duncan Irwin House along the Arroyo before she moved to Altadena. She was a dressmaker to prominent high society women. And all I can say is that the dressmaking business must have been very lucrative, judging from the house she could afford. I wish we could have found the architect's identity. It's often hard to differentiate between Spanish and Italian, but Italian houses are usually more refined, have a less sprawling footprint, and are more decorative. Wrought iron detailing is often used rather than wood detailing as in Spanish houses. If you can't tell Italian from Spanish, you can call just about anything with a tile roof Mediterranean. A lot of builders do that. This is a great looking house that quite recently went under a terrific amount of renovation. It was really falling apart. And those who have ever lived in Orange County, as I did, know that James McFadden established the first commercial wharf in that county. And supposedly built this house for himself and his daughter, although he didn't live very long here. This is an example of some of the hands-on research we had to do during the survey. So many times we'd find in old architectural magazines in reference to houses where only the community was identified. In this case, just Altadena, not the address and not even the first owner. I was pretty sure this house was along East Altadena Drive somewhere, so I would drive along with people honking behind me until the curvature of the mountains matched that of the old photo. I got out of the car, walked up an overgrown driveway, and there it was. It seemed pretty much the same, actually. You can see how wide open spaces Altadena was in 1916. I remember being asked to a Christmas party at this house. The two fellows who owned it provided a fancy buffet spread that we were given 45 minutes to eat. And then we were herded into the living room to listen to records of Christmas carols. The whole party was over by 8:30. This is a house by Green and Green, and kind of almost an Oriental style. It has an Italian feeling to it. The Gentry Company was a father and son design build firm. I felt duty bound to include an image of Altadena's most famous house. It's interesting that I discovered an exact duplicate of this house in the Hancock Park area in Los Angeles, although it was built of masonry and the interior was a lot more ornate than this one. I put this one in because Anna Latham was one of the area's only female designers and builders. It wasn't because she was doing, on record because her husband actually owned the house. Because she was a divorced woman and she did this as a living as a designer and builder. A building inspector in San Marino characterized her blueprints as some of the most well-drawn he had ever seen. Large houses such as these were sometimes used as speakeasies during the 1920s. Rosa Johnson, who you remember, maybe you remember some of you as Mrs. Altadena as we called her, was one of the older members of our group. And she remembered as an 18-year-old going to some of these houses with her sugar daddy, as she called him. And just like in the movies, someone would look at them through the peephole in the front door before they would let them in. Then, if accepted, they would proceed inside to the basement party room. So anyone who has a fitted-out basement in our large residence can speculate that it might have been used as a speakeasy. Why else would people put a big finished basement in their Southern California house? Another solid Italian that burned up. My father was common style found in Altadena, a Spanish colonial revival, which ranges from the characteristic, mildly decorated stucco bungalows to the high-blown tropical fantasies of the late 1920s and 30s. Generally, it features low to medium-pitched root tile or flat parapeted roofs, turrets, stucco or plaster finishes, arches, wing walls, occasional Palladian window treatments, and plaster cast Baroque applications. I questioned Rosa several times if she could remember which houses she visited as speakeasies, but she claimed she couldn't remember. This was a very decorative Spanish Renaissance design by an East Coast architect that was opposite our first garden party house, and unfortunately it's gone. This is Wallace Neff's honeymoon house he shared with his first wife, Louise Updegraff. Neff was the grandson of Admiral McNally and spent quite a bit of time in Altadena as a boy. This house could also be called rural Italian. On the right end, it has a pair of arched windows separated by a classical pilaster, a hallmark of early Neff designs. It miraculously survived the fire when most of its neighbors opposite the golf course burned down. You see Spanish revival look in the small bungalow by Ainsworth. And here's another one that didn't survive by the same architect. This one was designed by Clarence J. He's the fellow that designed the mausoleum at the cemetery. Another beautiful Spanish revival. And architect Fitch Haskell lived in Altadena. This is a sprawling rural Spanish resembling an early hacienda that was Kenneth Gordon's own home. Although it is sited adjacent to Eaton Canyon, it didn't burn. There's another one, house by Anna Latham, but more subdued than the one before. Often described as a fusion of Spanish and colonial revival, Monterey Revival features a low-pitched, gabled or hipped roof, usually shingled, a projecting second-story porch or balcony, stucco or board and batten wall treatments, and shuttered multi-pane sash or casement windows. It is one of the few indigenous California styles. You could call this one of the first 20th century California ranch houses in Altadena. But I think it also recalls early California with its wraparound porch and rustic appeal. Mayberry probably designed the house as his own home. And this and the next one are more typical Monterey revivals with their second story almost full-width balconies. Both in the Altadena Country Club Park area. And for those of my colleagues in the Altadena Community Church, the congregation first met in 1941 in the game room of this estate. It was at 425 East Los Flores, which is no longer here. You can see the balcony is kind of in the middle of the two wings of the house. This style is known for exaggeratedly high-pitched roofs, often gabled and shingled, entry towers, half-timbered walls in the Norman-influenced examples, multi-pane casement windows, and use of decorative wrought iron, especially around the entrances. Here's a nice one in the Altadena Country Club Park, that's another one by Marston. There's another one with a very exaggerated gable. This is another treasure by Wallace Neff, and I'm surprised to see it survive the fire of his over on the west side. It was once a country estate surrounded by many acres. Dorothy Buffum Chandler of Music Center fame lived in the house as a girl, but when asked about it, scoffed that I never lived in West Altadena. The owner had proof that she was there because they measured the growth of the kids. And there was Dorothy on the or Marchetta Street. This is David Ogilvy's own house. She's saying that it was a beautiful little house. Well, not that little, but it's a one-story house that is no longer with us. There's another one by Ogilvy, which did survive. And this is a French revival that has an entry tower and half timbering on the walls, which made people think it's English revival, but actually it's Norman. Here we are with English revival. These houses range from storybook examples to more traditional styles. They include half-timbered walls, gabled roofs, thick-work, and multi-pane casement windows. This house by Marston was on Millionaire's Row. Millionaire's Row could have been a National Register district before the fire took out most of the houses, including the McNally houses and Gray House and others. Another nice house in West Altadena, there's no more. You can't leave out the quintessential English storybook cottages built in the subdivisions of James Village in West Altadena. The saga of Elisha James and his reputed fly-by-night real estate development schemes of hundreds of these cottages could be the subject of the program all by itself. There were only about 5 floor plans, but they were built behind a great variety of facades. James Village is going to celebrate its 100th birthday in May, but the fire determined otherwise, wiping out most of the houses. I met with Bunch Design in La Cañada recently, who are compiling a catalog of James designs and floor plans for anyone interested in rebuilding them. Although developed in a patchwork, James Village could have qualified as a thematic historic district. This is James House across the street, which didn't survive. In fact, that whole side of that street is gone. As I mentioned, the James houses were built in sort of groups, so there are quite a few on various other streets as well, but very few have survived, unfortunately. Devonshire Lane was kind of a cute little block-long collection of English cottages, just off the Mariposa, and the whole street was destroyed by the fire. Another nice looking English revival. This is the Grand Dame of English revival houses in Altadena. Although singed, it survived the fire. It was once surrounded by 5 acres and included a ballroom. We have never discovered who the architect was, although it may have been the little-known Hank Hasford, who designed D. Hart Luce's Hancock Park home in 1921 before he moved to Altadena. Looks more like a Paul Williams or something like that, but it's unusual that it hasn't been documented anymore. This is a very rare style, patterned after the Pueblo Indian homes of the American Southwest. It is characterized by plaster walls, flat roofs, wooden lintels above the window and door openings, and the use of vigas, protruding pieces of wood at the roof level that in ancient examples help to support the roof. In Pueblo revival houses, the vigas are purely decorative, but vary in their appearance, sometimes resembling rough-hewn branches, but often rather inauthentic in their machine-made conformity. This is one of our great hotly losses from the fire, designed by famous architect Elmer Gray, known for his sometimes off-the-wall designs. The Elegy family lived here for many years. Branch-like vigas were inserted in rather a higgledy-piggledy pattern, lending to their seeming authenticity. This is another advantaged example, but of a more inauthentic use of vigas, machine-made vigas. And here's the Pueblo Bible that survived the fire. When I drove by to take a better picture, it was swathed in plastic sheeting, which told me remediation was in progress. So now we come to the final one, which is modern. I'm also including contemporary styles in this category. I often ask architectural historians, well, what comes after contemporary? What more can we say? But period revival styles are coming back, so they're in full circle. Branch styles, which came to predominate after World War II, actually started to become popular as early as the 1930s, but the war interrupted their progress. After the war, besides the ubiquitous ranch style, post and beam construction, often credited to the architecture school at USC, made its appearance. As its name implies, its main supports were posts and beams with a copious use of glass. Architects working in this style are said to incorporate the same philosophy as those of the Craftsman era, where structural elements are exposed and the landscape becomes part of the house. The fire took modern and contemporary architecture in the shorts, as they say. Altadena was pretty well built out by the end of World War II, so new construction took place mostly in the foothills, which is where the fire was most destructive. This is an example of a ranch style from 1939, which demonstrates how this now common type predated World War II. This is the house which Hans mentioned as the home of one of Altadena's more questionable residents. It has a few features we would call modern: the use of glass brick, porthole type window, and other wraparound windows. The house and its notorious one-time occupant have now both disappeared. Here is the now gone, strictly designed home of Altadena architect Harold Biston. It won a number of design awards for its forward-looking, energy-efficient design. This is one of the last surviving examples of Gregory A. designed Park Place development along Highview Avenue north of Mariposa. A number of look-alike houses along the street were being restored when the fire hit. Sunny Oak Circle is a veritable museum of post and beam architecture that was almost totally wiped out in the fire. This was Carl Straub's own house that he designed for himself. It was a modern house that no more. As is this one. This house survived the fire because it was one of the few contemporaries built on the flats and not in the foothills. The one that's on East Palm, way over on the west side, that is gone. Now, this is an interior shot of Boy George's own house. The exterior of the house was shrouded by shrubbery for years before it was ultimately destroyed by the fire, so the only picture I could find was one of the interior. We have on Monrosa Street, which is near the perimeter. This was a case study house on Santa Rosa that is also on the flats. Case study houses were commissioned by Arts and Architecture magazine after World War II to spark architectural innovation by challenging architects to utilize new materials and technologies to design progressive but modern houses in Southern California. This is the interior. This one was almost in the shape of an A-frame, which was fitting for its mountainous environment, because it was in the mountains that burned up. So here we are, back safe and sound where we started our tour. Thank you for your attention. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
I was told that those Miller Street houses were built without kitchens. And the person who told me that said, because everybody ate at the country club.
I've heard that of the houses that were along Country Club Road. Could be that some in Sonora, but I don't recall finding any in Sonora. But,
She dated somebody who owned one, and he had to have a kitchen.
oh, maybe it might be the ones that were closest to the Country Club, but the ones that were in actually right next to the Country Club very seldom had kitchens. Okay, well,
Here's a question.
Oh, yeah.
Which of these styles is most earthquake resistant? Just natural. The way it's originally built.
Well, the modern contemporary were supposedly built a little more, to modern standards. But I think all the older houses were built to the old building codes, which really depends on location. That last big earthquake we had, there was a whole line down from the north to the south part of Altadena along New York Drive, where all the chimneys toppled. So because they were all built on one part of the ground that was unstable. And the ones on both sides, that's fine. So It really depends on the location. Hi, Michelle.
I just wanted to say that the first house built in Altadena by Benjamin Eaton that's still standing on Oakwood, inside, it's still quite the same as it was. And it's just that they closed in the front porch. And so to grab a little space. But I've taken groups of teachers there. And you can see the house that Benjamin Eaton built.
Well, it is very well maintained, because it's glad to say.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am?
We were in at Jane's house for 37 years, and we were told by an engineer who was in his 90s, who was some ancient Caltech engineer, who came by to look at our, what do you call it, under the house, where you can go under?
Crawl space.
Yeah, like a crawl space. He went under our crawl space to look at stuff, and he said that James had put in all kinds of stuff that wasn't used yet to help resist earthquakes. I don't know if anyone else knows about that, but there were diagonal braces underneath that weren't required until later.
Well, I think Jane's got a bad reputation because he wasn't a very good salesman. He kind of skipped town. But I think the people he employed to build the houses, you know, did their best. And
Had you heard that before?
I hadn't heard, I heard they were well-built houses, but not that they had extras. Yes, ma'am.
I have a quick question about the money from Getty. Sometimes trees can be considered part of the cultural landscape. Will they be documenting unusually large specimens that are adjacent to some of these houses you're looking at?
Well, if it's a real cultural resources survey, which I'm hoping it will be, then I think trees and flora would be part of it, not just the buildings. But when they talk about historic resources survey, it sort of clicks in my mind, well, that's what we did. But I think what they're trying to do is something broader than that.
What did the Altadena Country Club, what style would that have fallen under?
Well, the first one was strictly a craftsman, designed by Glick. And the second one in the 20s was designed by Ogilvy again. And that, well, he tried to be as rustic as he could. I'd say it's more craftsman, really, than anything, even though it was built later.
What do you know about the architecture of the homes on La Venezia on the west side off of?
Well, off the top of my head, I can't remember, but we did include those on the survey. It was a nice little court of Spanish-style houses. And I think they were actually built by an Italian person. So they're a little more authentic, you know.
1929?
Somewhere in the 20s.
Do you happen to know whether it might be, fire departments might ever research historical buildings in the communities that they're tasked with protecting? And that, I've got to say, I was a little more than appalled that our fire department seemed to have no knowledge of the historical buildings that might have been prioritized for protection, whether there's any interface with historical organizations and fire chiefs so that they could say, these are the places we'd really like you to, you know,
Well, I think
staff out.
the county came to historic preservation very late.
Late.
They didn't have a preservation ordinance until 2015, which, can you imagine? They had no protection, and so that's why Altadena Heritage stepped in to at least identify these places. But I don't think there's any government interplay, which really annoyed me. We did all this work, and we kind of got passed off by people. That's one of the reasons I wanted to speak, was just to refresh people's memory that this survey does exist.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
So you kind of blew through the mid-century, and so I have a 1952 mid-century, so I'm really kind of interested, so I can pay tribute to that during my rebuild. What are your comments that you might be able to enlighten me about during that period?
Is that, would you consider a modern house? I mean,
I do.
It's not post and beam, though, it's not.
You know, I'm not sure.
Well, I
It might
think,
be.
I think we would probably consult individually about this. I need to know more about maybe some photographs. You can provide me some photographs. Yes, ma'am.
Go ahead.
Thanks. I know that you shared one photo from the interior. Do you have many other photos of the interiors of any of these homes?
No, unless the Historical Society's inherited them from people. That's why I'm hoping that those of you who live in, unique houses will share photographs of them, because I know in my own business as a photographer, I often get asked that about interiors, and they just aren't there. And what you have to do if you really want to is to contact people who might have lived in the house, because the interior might not be a picture of the interior, but it'll be part of the picture about people in front of it. And in the same way with houses too, people are so amazed there's not a picture of their beautiful house in the archives. Well, unless, it was donated to the archives, and it would be saved.
So I know of a couple that bought on La Venezia a lot there, and they're going to move a historical house from LA, a Victorian, to that property. They're in the process of trying to do that. Do you know how many others might be doing that?
Well, I just heard of the two that have been hit the press recently. They're kind of brought back to my mind because they're moving in pieces, which I do in my house too. I was lucky because I had spent at the time and lost were still reasonable. Right now, to buy a lot, plus moving the house is almost as well as expensive as if you bought it on site.
Houses like the Tim Gregory house and the Lanterman house, you mentioned that they were designed as fire-proof. What does that mean? Just internal fire, not a brush fire, as we saw in the old.
Mostly it would be the concrete walls. Lanterman house had all concrete walls, reinforced concrete.
Can you repeat the question, please? Can you repeat the question?
Oh, the houses that are considered fire resistant, why were they fire resistant? And I think it's mostly because of the concrete walls, reinforced concrete. Lanterman House in La Cañada is one. And Dr. Lanterman had the house designed because he'd seen what terrific ruins there were in San Francisco because of the earthquake. So he wanted the house that would withstand earthquakes. Okay, well, thank you very much.